My name's Angela Ferguson and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's AARE Schools and Education Systems Special Interest Groups interactive presentation on engaging with research in schools. Our three presenters are Ms. Shani Prendergast of Catholic Education Melbourne, Associate Professor Mark Rickinson of Monash University, and Professor Peter Twining of the University of Newcastle. I wish to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from across the nation where each of us are gathered today and recognise that Australia has always been a place of teaching and learning. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to play within the education and research community. Tulam Magala Emala, which means, I acknowledge that the spirits are with you. Before we start, some brief housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted. If you have questions, please type them in the chat window and we'll address them at the end of the three presentations. We'll invite each person to unmute and address their question to the presenter at that point in time. Today's event is being web conferenced through Zoom and I extend a warm welcome to staff from universities, schools, public and private education sectors, and Department of Education staff in Queensland and other jurisdictions from across the country. We even have a listener from Taiwan. Welcome everyone. The web conference recording will be available on the AARE website within a few weeks. So should you know of colleagues who've missed today's session, please let them know they can access this recording. In today's presentation on engaging with research in schools, we will hear three experts outline how to engage with research in schools. Ms. Shani Prendergast is the Senior Research Analyst with Catholic Education Melbourne. Schools are often asked to be participants and sometimes partners in academic research projects. While schools report some projects to be highly beneficial, they suggest other projects are not as engaging. Shani will share her research about how schools and researchers can get the most out of working together. Mark Rickinson is an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education at Monash University. His work is focused on understanding and improving the use of research in education. He is currently leading the Monash Q project, a 5-year initiative with the Paul Ramsay Foundation to improve the use of research evidence in Australian schools. Peter Twining is Professor of Education at the University of Newcastle, New South Wales. He was formerly the Professor of Education Futures at the Open University in the United Kingdom, where he directed the £9.4 million Vital Professional Development Programme, whose provision revolved around practitioner research. Please remember to leave audience questions to the end of the presentation and feel free to type them into the chat window. I'll now invite our first presenter, Shani, to share her insights on schools participating in research.
Good on you, Ange. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Very warm welcome. Before I get stuck into my brief presentation, I absolutely want to give a high five to all teachers and leaders during this really difficult time. You've been inspirational and amazing to pivot so quickly and continue the remote learning of your students that you care much about. So high five. I also want to give elbow bumps to researchers. I know that your projects have been put on hold, particularly in Victoria. You still can't contact schools, so acknowledging the difficult situation that you have been in. And a massive hug to Melburnians and Victorians at the moment, including myself. It is a tough time, so really extra appreciate your time today. So as Ange said, this is a great opportunity to have a shared conversation about the different elements of school research engagement. So 3 of those sort of streams are schools participating in research, schools using research, and schools doing research. We often talk about those 3 things separately, but today's a chance to really, well, we will touch on the 3 of them separately, also a chance to start joining the dots and look at some of those things that are similar or things that connect those 3 streams of school research engagement. So what I would like to do in my brief time 15 minutes or so. Firstly, just share some of the high-level learnings that I've learned research, but also ongoing engagement with schools and researchers about what's the school experience as participants and sometimes partners in academic research projects. What have we learned from that? But I want to spend most of my time on giving 8 tips. So 4 tips will be, how do we get more schools to say yes to academic research projects conducted in their school? But also, how do we get them to say yay about their experience? So 8 tips in total. If I've got time, I want to very quickly share a resource that will help it together. And off just flagging some connections today about schools using and doing research. So great. Moving to the next slide there, Ange, thank you. So what have we learned? I know this is hard to not focus so much on the learnings and focus on the doing as a result of the learnings. Researchers want to know more about the findings, but I'm going to be more practical today and focus on the tips. So this will be quite quick, but you'll be able to find more information if you want about these learnings. So in 2016, conducted an empirical study with Catholic Education Melbourne schools to find out what is their experience in research projects conducted in their schools. So it's called the user study, stand engagement in and with research. Through a survey, focus groups and interviews, we wanted to find out very simply basic questions starting from how often are you approached to engage in research projects? Do you say yes or no? What are your reasons for saying yes or no? Tell us about some good projects, some not so good projects. And then from there, worked with Mark Rickinson from Monash Uni, who's with us obviously today, to explore how do those findings connect with the broader literature. And Mark and I co-wrote a publication in 2019 and have been having ongoing conversations about this topic. So these are informed by the evidence, by their study, by the evidence and ongoing conversations with both schools and researchers. So that main finding there in the bold pink, schools are, rightly and understandably, very selective about their research involvement. So we found through our study that schools get approached to participate in academic research projects often, but they actually say no most of the time. And our survey results showed that they say no 4 out of 5 times, which means they were only saying yes on average to about 20%. Their main reason for saying no or yes was around their perception of the relevance of the project, but also their perception of the demand versus the value. So what I'd really like to focus on is how do we get more schools to say yes? So these are some researchers, and how do we not only get them to say yes, but yay about their experience? Thanks, Ange. Next slide. So it's always a challenge when you put up all your tips all at once, but anyway, bear with me, they're all there, but we're going to go through them one at a time fairly quickly given our short time together. So the first one, it does sound obvious, I appreciate, have a line of sight to student learning. Schools are a captive audience with many students in them, so that's research and not always education. So schools can be critical of research that doesn't help them do their core work, and obviously quite positive then about research that has a line of sight to student learning. So the tip for schools is to think about how might that research project, when you're being approached, help you do your core work, and for researchers to think about a really clear and compelling purpose statement. You would be surprised at how many sort of plain language statements or principle letters we read where it is not clear on what the research is seeking to do and how it links to the core work of schools. Number 2, making explicit links to school level priorities. I appreciate that that's not always possible for every research project, but actually jurisdictions often get applications from researchers that are targeting a small cohort of schools, often 10 or less. So the opportunity to think about how your research project might actually align with school priorities of the schools that you're targeting is really important where you can do that. Do your research, have a look on their websites, think about how might your research help schools deal with their current priorities. That was actually the #1 reason in our study why schools would say yes to a research project, if they could see a clear link to their school improvement goals. So an important one if you can do it, and one of the things that principals are thinking about when they're deciding whether to engage in a project or not. Number 3, considering the benefits and if you're a researcher, offering something in return, something tangible, and if you're a school, asking for something tangible. So schools were much more open to higher demand or higher impost on them if they could see that they were getting something out of it. So while schools were saying no most often, it was very clear in the user study and in the broader literature, schools do value research and they see that they have a critical role in helping to create evidence and do research, but they also want to get something out of it. And actually the examples they gave, they weren't big. So for example, offering a small professional learning session for staff, half an hour on the research topic, school-specific feedback or a school-specific report if possible. Some small tangible things that can be given back to the schools and help them say yes in the first place. All right, minimising demands. You can imagine the number one reason for saying no in our user study were if schools thought that the demands were unreasonable and certainly in comparison to the value that they perceived. If they thought they were going to get a lot out of it, they were more open to higher time demand. But if they couldn't really see the value, they were quite critical of the demand. The other thing that came through there is really making sure that those demands or expectations are clear. So schools might say no because it's not clear, but we're encouraging them to actually discuss with the researcher, clarify any ambiguity, flexibility, can the timing be changed rather than saying an outright no. And for researchers, the tip there is really in your communications with schools, don't make them read through pages to work out what actually you're asking them to do. A simple table in a plain language statement or principal letter can go a long way, and be transparent. Schools did talk about when perhaps something was said, but then something else was done. So minimising demands and seek flexibility where you can. So they're the 4 tips on getting a yes. 4 tips on not just getting a yes from schools, but getting a yay for their experience. So number 5, conducting the research with, not to. That was a really strong theme. In the examples where schools and both researchers gave where they thought that the research project went well, there was a real sense of working together and in partnership. So where possible, thinking about how might you learn about a school's prior knowledge of a research topic or even their experience in research before, and trying to include that in the research design or the way the research is conducted. If that's not possible, even just small things like really honouring the way a school operates, honouring their timetables and showing that you are willing to be flexible, work with them to make the research work and not do the research to them. Number 6, this was again a strong theme too. In the examples that schools gave where they felt they got a lot out of the research project, the key theme was having an element of professional learning or an element of where their capability was being built. So they were more open to and were more favourable towards research where they felt that they were learning too, and some fantastic examples provided by schools and researchers. And this number 6 here connects to the schools doing research and what Peter will talk about later. With some great academic research projects in schools include schools doing, teachers, leaders doing their own inquiry or action research. And schools did report favourably around that element of learning to the professional learning, their capability being built. Number 7, no surprise there around relationships, so critical. Researchers and schools both telling us that the research projects that work well and often go well beyond the end date of a research project is where those relationships were taking time to be built. So before a research project, meeting with the school and the researcher, building rapport, clarifying expectations, dealing with issues throughout a research, and even beyond the research project, checking back in. If you're a school or a researcher, or even system person, you'll be able to give examples where relationships were critical to successful research projects. So where possible, keep that in your minds. And the last one there, again, sounds a little bit obvious, sharing the learnings, but we were surprised to hear from many of our schools in the user study that they often did not receive any feedback or any findings, even though that's a condition of jurisdiction approval for researchers conducting research in schools. It often wasn't happening. And we're not necessarily talking about waiting for an academic publication to be published to share that, but even having a small half-an-hour feedback session with the leadership team, if you can, to give some feedback, or even just a short one-page summary about what those findings were. And if possible, again, thinking about how you might help with the mobilisation of those findings. What might schools do next where they're considering what they learnt? And then a theme in the literature also is if schools are more actively engaged in a research project, they're more open to using and engaging with the findings. Thanks, Ange. How are we going for time? Okay, just another minute or so. I just wanted to flag, I mean, those 8 tips are obviously more practical, but I wanted to flag this resource here. It's called the Insider's Guide that CEM developed 2 years ago now, where we brought researchers, school leaders and teachers together for the first time to have a shared conversation about what does a good, meaningful, impactful research project look like from both sides, researchers and schools. And we actually found there was a lot of synergy. And so we developed this very simple framework around 4 phases of conducting a research project. And the Insider's Guide has some tips for both researchers and schools to think about what they can do at each phase to get the most out of that research project. So the next slide, thanks Ange, that can be downloaded. We just did a short run of hard copies, but it can be downloaded on the CEM website. So either take a screenshot or take a photo, or you can email me and I can send you the link if you want to connect with that user Insider's Guide. And also on that same webpage are the findings from the user project and a link to the publication that Mark and I wrote a year or so ago now. So there's some, links to some further resources, etc. And reach out if you want to have a chat further. Thanks everyone. Questions later, but I will now hand over to one of my very favourite colleagues, Mark Rickinson, to talk about schools using research.
Thanks so much, Shani. I'd really kind of echo your appreciation to colleagues on the line. I know how busy and challenging a time it is at the moment for school leaders, system leaders, and researchers. So it's that we have any audience here, particularly as it's a sunny day in Melbourne, is greatly appreciated. So thank you. And thanks also to Angela Ferguson up in Queensland. I think this schools and education systems interest group does great work, Angie, in terms of being able to bring together the kinds of partners that Shani's talking about in order to talk about research, the relationship between research and practice and policy. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm going to move to the schools using research, and kind of helped by a steer from Ange earlier on in preparation for this event. I'm going to try and frame it around 3 questions. So what does schools using research mean? What does using research well look like? And what are the potential of this particular type of engagement with research? So if we could jump to the next slide, Ange, which is simply restating my first question. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, and we can jump to the next slide. So this, I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but it's the quote on the left is I think a really helpful one for just kind of people to the idea of what does using research mean in a school context. I like this description or definition for a number of reasons. Firstly, it kind of talks about it as a process. That's important. So there's some a complex undertaking in the sense that, and it's also there as an active. You know, there's the process of actively in with and drawing on. So there's something about it's a process and it's active, which I think is important for us to hold on to when we think about the use. It's often can be thought about too simply. It's just research goes into schools and gets used. I also like it in the sense that there are 3 verbs: to inform, to change, and to improve. And that just for me just kind of holds on to another source of complexity, which is that we do need lots of verbs to kind of bring to life what it means to use research in schools, and in fact in any setting. The other thing I like about it is that the focus of the verbs are two things: decision making and practice. And that's nice, because it just kind of opens up also not just the fact that we need varied verbs, but also the uses to which research is put are also varied. And I think the decision making and practice covers quite a lot of potential activities within a school. So moving to the other side of the, not to the next slide, sorry, Ange, but just to the right-hand side of the of the screen as you see it. The truth is, though, this is not well researched, and it sounds bizarre, but it's not. We actually don't know that well how schools use research. It's not well theorized. It's not that well researched, and it's particularly not well researched empirically in Australia. When I did the work with Shani around the user project, we did a lit review at the time, so it would have been late, so 2018 kind of time, and it was very clear that there was very little work done in the Australian context around the use of research in schools. That's not saying that there isn't research being used, and there are, you know, at all, but I'm just saying it's not been well researched. But a piece of work that is helpful here is there was an article published in the British Education and Research Journal in sort of October 2019, I think it was. Lead author was Tim Kane, and about the same time a Routledge book came out from Tim Kane called Becoming a Research-Informed School, if I remember rightly. Now, for me, that book and that article kind of most helpful kind of orientation means to use research in schools, and they identify three different areas: informing decision-making, extending teaching mindsets, and developing intelligent communities. Those are important because one is about kind of decision-making by leaders or teachers in terms of planning, but the point is it's separate from the action of teaching. It's more using research to make decisions about what practice to implement or what change to make. Teaching mindsets is more about actually the way research helps teaching practice is not in terms of being used in the moment, in the day-to-day fast thinking decision-making in the classroom. It's more about changing the way teachers think about things, giving new conceptual frameworks or understandings of familiar problems. And then the develop intelligent communities is more about research changing the kind of culture of the school, becoming a research engaged school where the kind of nature and quality of the discussion and debate within the school is changed. So anyway, I'll just give those as background, and let's move on now to the this question of what does using research well look like. Now, I could have spent all my time just on what's involved in using research. So next slide, Ange. This is work that I'm doing, and I'm guessing there are some colleagues from the CUBE project on the call in this meeting, but it's basically a 5-year project with in partnership with the Paul Ramsay Foundation that we're doing at Monash, and it's looking specifically at what does it mean to use research well in education, and we've termed that quality use. And our argument is that a lot of the focus in education and in other sectors has been on not enough on the quality of the use. So we're trying to understand what does it mean to use research evidence well. And we're doing that in trying to think about how to conceptualize it, which is we're drawing on literature, both from social care, health, policy and education, to try to say, well, what does it mean to use research evidence well in health or social care? Or we learn from that in relation to using evidence well in education. And I'll talk about that in a moment. We're also doing research with schools in a very similar way to Shani. Hopefully we're following the kind of the 8 tips for a yes and a yay. But we're definitely trying to, you know, do work in partnership with 100 schools across 4 states. And then we will, later in the process, we're sort of in the second year of the 5-year project, we'll be developing professional learning. And all the while, we're thinking about how can we embed this within school systems. So I'll move on to the next slide. Our current framing, and this is predominantly conceptual at this stage, is that what using research evidence well means is thoughtful engagement with an implementation of appropriate research evidence. So what's important is that those two kind of adjectives of the thoughtfulness of the engagement and the implementation and the appropriateness of the research evidence. And if we jump to the next slide, Ange, that kind of gives you a visual. So we've developed a framework, the Quality Use of Research Evidence Framework, which if you're looking to get hold of it, it's freely available on the Q Project website. If you literally just search QURE framework, it will come up. And if we jump to the next slide, and what I'll do is just talk through, we've basically got kind of four layers. And at the core, we've got these two core components of appropriate research evidence and thoughtful engagement and implementation. So we're trying to draw attention to the interaction, or it's a kind of an aspiration, I suppose, to use research evidence well in a school context means moving from available evidence to appropriate evidence. And that's thinking about have research evidence that's rigorous. Of course, that's important, but it's not enough. It also needs to be appropriate and relevant to the context, the problem that you're trying to work on, and the way in which you want to use it. So that appropriateness is important. So too is the thoughtfulness, because research it doesn't tell you what to do. In fact, when you sort of can fall into that thing of thinking it's going to tell you what to do, but it doesn't. There's not a direct line of sight from research to practice. It's something you have to engage with, think about, and often that needs to be done with others. So it's a kind of shared deliberation. Yeah, I mean, the point is that both of those are very interconnected. And this is reflected it comes through in the literature in health, in social care particularly, where this integration of research knowledge with professional knowledge is right at the heart of being a really proficient user of research evidence. So if we move slide, Ange, just is for us to talk about is not just kind of what it means to do it well, but also what helps, what enables it, and also what impedes it. What's come through from the literature, the systematic review of literature across the sectors that we did, and is also being reflected now in the work with schools, is that there are a number of components which are enabling of quality use at the individual level, and that doesn't mean an individual on their own. It's more people. So it's often groups, but it's at the level of people, and then there are certain components which are relevant at the level of the organisation, and surrounding that is system. So if I just take the individual level, skill sets have been well recognised for a long time, in that actually it's an intellectually demanding task to make sense of research. But what's coming through very clearly from the literature and also now from the empirical work is that there's a really important affective mindset dimension and a very important social relational relationships dimension. So using research evidence well is as much as about what I bring to it in terms of my beliefs, dispositions, and also who I'm doing it with. So that's really important. And then in terms of at the organizational level, yes, leadership's important. Of course, leadership's important both in terms of creating a supportive organizational context, but also modeling effective use of research evidence. But so too is culture, a culture that supports risk-taking, a culture that supports question asking, a culture that supports or encourages explanations or reason giving for initiatives. But also infrastructure. Teachers and school leaders and middle leaders need time and resources in order to be able to engage with research evidence. So that's kind of, I've gone through that pretty quickly, but it's just to give you a sense of, and if you want to read more about it or hear more about it, if we go to the next slide, Ange, we have a webinar. I know you're probably fed up with Zoom webinars, but you're here today and you might just be interested. There is a webinar happening next Wednesday in the evening. And if you go to the Monash Faculty of Education site, the events page, you can still register for that. And we've got Nigel Holloway from Hamlin Banks Primary School. So we've got a school principal perspective. We've got Jenny Donovan, the inaugural director of the National Evidence Institute, speaking from a system perspective. And someone called Shani Prendergast, don't know if any of you have heard of her. Anyway, senior research analyst at Catholic Ed Melbourne. She's talking about from a jurisdiction perspective. So there will be more discussion about the framework, quality use, and what it might mean for Australian schools at that event in like just under a week's time. Okay, if we jump to the final question, what are the possible drawbacks? And this is really important. In all our talk about use of schools using research evidence, we really always need to be aware not just of the potential, but also the limitations of research evidence use. So if we jump to the last slide, Ange, and hopefully I'm going to come in on time for you. The two big cautions, I think the most significant ones are at the top of the slide. There was a book published this year in kind of tribute to Jeff Whitty called Knowledge, Policy and Practice in Education and the Struggle for Social Justice. And there was a chapter in that book, and it's a free, open access, freely available book published by Routledge. And there was a chapter in it by Jenny Gore from Newcastle, so one of your colleagues, Peter. And it was, I forget the subtitle, but it was called Why Isn't This Empowering? And it's an amazing piece of work. Jenny just takes apart various approaches to teacher development, one of which was research-informed practice, and kind of lays bare why it can often be not empowering to educators. And there's a lot in that. And one of the biggest concerns is that when you start talking about use of research evidence, almost always the research evidence is external to the school, and often it can be done in a way which is undermining of educators' professional knowledge. And we must never forget that. Of course, what we want is the integration, is that research knowledge kind of complements and integrates with professional knowledge to create something much more powerful, but so often it can be undermining. The other thing in the top right is that research use can be a bit of a sideshow. Research use can be about kind of an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And I think it always has to be thought of in terms of how is this serving educational improvement as opposed to how can we get research used. So that's another really important kind of caution. The bottom left is that it can be done as, like anything, it can be a tick box exercise. You know, where, we've got research-based practice, we're using research-based programs, and it can be actually quite superficial, or it can be done very narrowly, where the focus is on just a very particular type of research evidence. And, you know, that can be very aggravating, very annoying to researchers and actually very unhelpful to practitioners. And just lastly, the bottom right, the point I've made earlier is that this is not a well-researched area in a bizarre way. So it's not that well-researched, it's not that well theorized. And when it is, it's not researched as a practice. And we're trying to address that. Just the last slide, Ange, would be if you wanted, any more information about the Q project, there's the web address and the Twitter feed is there. And there's a few publications there that we've put out, and we've got a lot more in the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to stop my share because Peter's going to take over sharing. So I now invite Peter to share his insights on schools and teachers doing research.
Okay, I still haven't got the power to share. Okay, so let's go with that one. So I hope you can all see my screen, the main screen rather than one with all my notes. I'm Peter Twining, it's great to be here. Thanks to Shani and Mark, who've set me up nicely for my little bit. I should warn you, I'm playing with some new software. It may not work, so who knows. I'm at Peter T on Twitter. Please do tweet and follow me and I will respond to comments. And I should give you some warnings. I'm not very good at doing what it says on the can. I don't know what the abstract said I was going to talk about, and I may not talk about that at all. And I also need to warn you that I'm kind of new to Australia. I only moved here from England in November, and so most of what I'm talking about relates to the English context more than the Australian context. And I also need to warn you that my work is really mostly has been around use of digital technology and implementing digital technology in schools and using it across the curriculum. And I would absolutely not claim to be an expert on practitioner research. So, you know, some provisos. And most of my work around practitioner research has been related to the Vital Professional Development Programme that I directed quite a few years now, from 2009 to 2013. And within that project, all of the work we did was built around a practitioner research cycle. So let's look at what do I mean by practitioner research? And my starting point for this is thinking about reflective practice cycle. And we're all familiar with these. It's the idea that you identify a need, and having identified a need, you then think about, well, so what am I going to do to identify that need in my classroom? How am I going to try and tackle that thing? So you come up with a plan, and then you implement it. You try it out in your classroom and you see how well it works. So you do whatever you plan to do to address the need. And then you reflect on it. You think, what have I learned from this? What went well? What would I do differently? And that might then take you around the cycle again. And what it will also do is it will enhance your personal knowledge base. You'll have learned something through the process. And of course, next time round, that will help you to plan and think more clearly about what you're going to do. So that's a fairly traditional reflective practice cycle. But, you know, reflective practice cycles can definitely be, and there's some kind of key elements that I think are missing from a reflective practice cycle that we really ought to add in. So having identified the need, what you really ought to do is find out what we already know about it. And that will come from your personal knowledge base, but you know, it really ought to be drawing on the professional knowledge base. What do your colleagues know? What is already known out there about how to tackle this problem? So having found out, you then plan, you then implement, you then reflect, and of course that will enhance your personal knowledge base. It may take you around the cycle again, but there's another really important stage that's missing, and that's sharing. It's now, what have you found? Share it back with the community. And ideally, when you're sharing it with the community, you're going to involve some sort of peer review process because we know of the publications. And really importantly, you know, that helps us build the professional knowledge base. And it links in with Mark's point about not undermining teacher professionalism. Teachers ought to be the owners of the professional knowledge base. We oughtn't be just using information that's out there that someone else has created, but we should be creating the knowledge base on which teaching is founded. So that's a practitioner research cycle. But of course, practitioner research is full of challenges. I like to think of them as elephants in the room. And the first one probably is to do with ethics. Within the UK context, there is no equivalent of a human research ethics committee for schools, for teachers doing research. At best, a teacher will ask the principal, the head, if they can do the research. They're probably unaware of the ethical guidelines. So in England, there's the British Educational Research Guidelines on educational researchers. And they may do things that we would think of as unethical. They may not get informed consent, for example. So they will tell their kids to all fill in a survey, but not give them a choice not to. And then you've got the issue of research literacy. To what extent do teachers have the capabilities to be able to ask sensible research questions and the methodological competence to investigate them and then to analyze them? And then linked in with that, we have the issue about access to published material. All those publications that are, you know, in peer-reviewed journals that you have to pay to get access to. And then we have the issue about teachers being rather self-effacing and not recognizing and valuing their own expertise. So being nervous about sharing their expertise with other people. This elephant should probably have been bigger. That issue about, you know, is it reasonable to expect teachers to engage with practitioner research as well as doing their day job? Of being a teacher. And what I want to do is kind of get us to reframe some thinking about that and look at kind of some potential solutions. And I think the first thing is that, you know, schools need to become learning organisations. They need to embed practitioner research within their processes and within their structures. So it's a fundamental part of what schools do. So they're supporting their staff in engaging in practitioner research. They become what Alison Holbrook would call research invested. And that includes things like investing in senior staff who have a responsibility for supporting practitioner research within the school community. It also includes making sure that they not only have access to published materials, but also the time to discuss them. So it becomes part of the discussion and the culture within the school to engage with the research process. And fundamentally, this is about changing the identity of teachers so that teachers become researchers as well as teachers, that it's part of their identity, of part of what teachers are expected to do. And of course, initial teacher education has a really important role to play here, making sure that pre-service teachers are competent at engaging with and carrying out research. And obviously, there's an ongoing professional development requirement. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to talk a bit about some examples of professional development that's involved practitioner research. And I'm going to start by drawing upon the Vital Practitioner Research Professional Development Programme, which was looking at digital technology use in schools in England, so enhancing the use of digital technology across the curriculum. And we adopted a practitioner research cycle, and we went for a kind of a mixture of bottom-up and top-down approaches. So bottom-up, we had subject portals. If you as a teacher had an issue in your classroom, you could go to your subject portal and you would find little snippets of things, ideas from other teachers about how to address that issue that you could then try out in your classroom, and you could come back and share with other people. We had teach shares, which are like teach meets. So you'd have a practitioner talking about their practice through video conferencing, talking about how they'd addressed an issue, and then have a discussion about it for 15 minutes. So they were kind of half hour, 15 minutes of teacher sharing, 15 minutes of discussion. And part of the whole development of the professional learning networks that we were trying to engender so that teachers would have the opportunity to learn from each other. We kind of call that 15-minute CPD, the idea that you had small granules of stuff that teachers could engage with in the moment when it was relevant to them. We've got a problem, how are we going to address it? Let's find out what other teachers have done and try it out for ourselves. And of course, we also had courses, and they tended to be 20 hours long, but spread over 3 weeks, giving teachers time to identify a need, find out what other people knew about it, plan to do something, try it out in the classroom, reflect on it, and then share it back with the other course participants. So that you were kind of working them and supporting them in going through that practitioner research cycle. And then we had what we called the in-house professional development program, which was a one-year program, which involved the school, the senior leadership team, providing active support, identifying some objectives from the school development plan that a team of staff in the school were going to work towards, supported by an individual who we called a vital professional. And then what we did was we supported that professional development vital professional in supporting their team in investigating the problem. So we inducted them, we did a needs analysis, we looked at what the research already told us about how to address their problem, they planned to do something, they implemented it, and they were supported in going through this, basically through the practitioner research cycle. The external evaluation suggested that what they were getting was a really quality bespoke personal learning experience that impacted on practice. And if you're familiar with Guskey's 5 levels of evaluation of professional development, not only was it impacting on practice, but it was impacting on students' learning outcomes, which is fundamentally what we're about. If we move to Australia, and I did a kind of quick flick around, there's a lot of good work going on in Australia around practitioner research. Robert Stevens, I think, is in the audience today. He can tell you more about this, but this is a course, professional development training, that was offered in New South Wales, which effectively does the same thing as Vital did. It takes people through the practitioner research process and helps them to carry out research. And as within the English context, we're all suffering from the neoliberal agenda in which we kind of valorize positive methodologies. Now, if you're not doing a randomized controlled trial, is it really valuable research? And of course, if you take that view, then actually practitioner stories and practitioner evidence isn't seen as being high status. I got this out of the Late Educational Researcher, which happened to have 2 articles about practitioner research in it. So there's lots happening within the Australian context, but many of you probably know more about this than I do. So why I've already argued that practitioner research is important because it helps you to take ownership of the professional knowledge base. But it's also important because it's effective professional learning. And what I want to do is kind of map out what I think the characteristics of effective professional learning are. And this is based on a literature review that we carried out actually a while ago in 2009, which informed the development of the Vital Professional Development Programme. And the starting point, and I've written it up on my blog, starting point of strategic, you need to be impact focused. What is it you're trying to change about practice and learning outcomes within your school context? And you've got to evaluate it to say, have you actually had the impact you wanted to have? So effect focused, and it's evaluated to see if you've had the desired impact. It has to have active support of the senior leadership team. We know if you haven't got the senior leadership team on board, your professional, whatever you do in school actually is likely to be less effective. It needs to be school-based because you need to be doing things that teachers have the opportunity to engage with themselves in their classroom. There's no point teaching people to use a bit of software if they can't go and try that bit of software in their classroom the next day, because it's not going to help them improve their practice. It needs to be involving the whole team. And we know, again, the literature is very clear. If you've got the whole school or a whole team involved, professional development is more effective. And that implies it needs to be building on your internal expertise. You need to be recognizing what your teachers bring to the piece and building upon that and learning from that. And it needs to be evidence and research informed, as we've already heard Mark talking about. And if it's going to be evidence and research informed, you know, it's also partly got to be experimental and reflective. You've got to be willing to take risks, try things out and learn from the mistakes you make. And if you're building on evidence and research, you need to be using external expertise as well as internal expertise. Might give you a different perspective, might provoke you to think differently. But fundamentally, you need to be supporting sharing. You need to be looking at how you collaborate with each other and learn from each other and develop those professional learning networks so that you can be benefiting from the expertise of everybody involved. And we also know that, you know, one-off CPD, you know, the nice course, the conference you go to, or the one-off course, or dare I say even a session like this, is less likely to be impactful in terms of practice than something that is sustained over a prolonged period of time. Sure, also that what you're doing is practical, okay? And that might be in terms of cost. It might be in terms of the level of granularity. You know, is it that small 15-minute CPD, or is it a whole year program? And it's got to be integrated with your actual daily needs. Does it help you do your job better? Does it link in with your concern? Effective professional development has both a top-down component, the senior leadership support and the external pressures, and the bottom-up component of the needs of the teacher in their classroom and the needs of the children as learners. And I would argue that practitioner research hits all of those buttons. So it's a really effective form of professional learning. So to kind of sum up, what I think I'm saying is, you know, what did I say? I said practitioner research is important, and it's important for two main reasons for me. It makes teachers the owners of the professional knowledge base, it professionalizes them, and it's really the best form of professional learning there is. To be effective, schools have to be learning organizations, they have to be research invested, they have to be putting in place structures to support practitioner research. And if you want to follow up, follow that link at the top there. You'll be able to download a document that has my contact details, the references that I've drawn upon, and there's also an article in there which talks more about the Vital Professional Development Programme and how we use practitioner research. And I finished with 1 minute and 10 seconds to spare, which is great, so I shall shut up. I shall stop staring at my screen if I can work out how to do that. No, don't start drawing again. It's always dangerous playing with new technology. How do I stop sharing my screen? Any suggestions? End the show. Find my Zoom link and see if it will let me stop sharing. No, it does not want to let me stop sharing. Anyone know how I give you back control? Because I think you need to become host again.
Yes, I do.
You do.
Maybe I can ask you to.
hang on, let me tab through. I've completely lost my Zoom windows.
It's all right, I've got it. Reclaim host.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so it should be back to me. Let me see if I can find some questions in the chat window. So if you've got questions of our three presenters who've done an excellent job of talking to each of their three components of schools involved in research and engaging with research, please do type in a question in the chat window. We've got lots of people who've said hello. Hello back, everybody. Thank you for your hellos and welcomes. All right, I might start with a question if we don't have any others, so while people are thinking. How helpful would it be for teachers to be conceptualised as scientist practitioners? It's a term that's used in psychology, and I have a psychology background, and we were always encouraged to be scientist practitioners. Would that sort of reframing of a teacher in that way be a helpful concept?
The qualitative researcher in me is nervous about the positivist overtones that might be associated with that. Though, of course, as a qualitative researcher, I'm a scientist of sorts too. That would be my immediate reaction. But I think that whole notion of reconceptualizing teaching as being a process, as Mark talked about, which was not about just engaging with research, but being the creators of the knowledge base, I think is really important. Yeah. It's about reprofessionalizing teaching.
Thank you, Peter. Does anyone else want to comment?
Just jumping in the sense that there's such a long tradition of that, you know, that idea of teaching being, you know, an intensely kind of inquiry orientated activity. I think the terminology though, and the way in which that identity is kind of reclaimed needs to come from the profession rather than anyone beyond. Yeah, that's just my that's my sense. So I think that, you know, there's lots to draw on by looking backwards, but it needs to come from within.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. We have a question from Glenn Savage. It's Glenn, did you want to speak to your question? You can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, hi. Thanks everyone for a really interesting conversation. I appreciate it. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on department approval processes. And I was just thinking, in light of the fact that a lot of state departments take, you know, up to 9 to 12 months, sometimes longer, to approve applications for people to do research in schools. And, you know, to me, and how responsive and agile we can be in working with schools. And just to give a very quick example, like I am working with my local school, my son's school, and the idea came up on doing a small research project around an initiative that they're trialing. And we ultimately gave up because it would take us so long to get approval to do it, that the research wasn't able to be done in the time frame that was needed. So I just wondered if any of you had any thoughts on how departments might need to change as well to better allow you know, us and schools to work together to do meaningful work.
Can I leap in and I mean, two observations. Again, you know, in the UK, there is no equivalent of the state approving you doing research. You just ask the school, and it's up to the principal to agree for you to do the research or not. And now whether that's a good or a bad thing is up to debate. There is clearly a gulf between the kind of ethical requirements for teachers carrying out research and you carrying out research. So for example, SERAP in New South Wales, teachers don't have to apply through SERAP, but I do. So if you're an employee of the Department of Education, you don't have to apply to the department to carry out research. It's up to your principal, I understand. But Robert Stevens, who's here, knows more about that than me. And he looks after the SERAP thing. So maybe he'd be a good person to respond to this question. Sorry, Robert.
Can I just jump in there? Firstly, I'm a little bit surprised about that time frame. You know, we usually take up to 6 weeks to approve, and there are sometimes very complex applications or sensitive that may take a lot longer. Also, just want to clarify the distinction sometimes between departments approving versus an ethics committee, for example. Of course, we consider ethics and risk, but based on our findings from the user project, we now review applications through the lens of can we give feedback to the researchers that really maximise that research project for schools. And for example, we might give feedback around how the communications may sound different so it's more attractive to schools, or what they might be able to give back. So we see it as a value add, not just a gatekeeping role or process perspective. And I know as part of our research and education network with other jurisdictions, we're always thinking about how we can strengthen our processes so it is about maximising the experience and value add for schools and systems. And I don't know, you're from a department, you may have something to add there. I'm conscious of time and this is taking all of our question time.
Yeah, I agree with what you were saying, Shani. We're applying a different lens, and yes, there are some projects that are sensitive that take longer, but it's very unusual for them to take 9 to 12 months. And we certainly have a process where we triage our wait lists so that we're, you know, prioritising based on how the researcher has indicated you know, the time frame for their project. And for those that are attached to programs within schools, we recognise that the research needs to, you know, be prioritised because the program's about to start. Maybe if we move to another question quickly, as I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. I can see a question from Virginia M. Would you like to speak to your question, Virginia?
Yes, that's me. From Steiner Education. I'm very interested in the interface with practitioner research based on risk and innovation, and a national evidence base which is going to align teachers with what works. So what works has already been found out and teachers are to implement what works. So I'm interested in that tension and what people think.
The whole, sorry, Mark, go for it.
No, you go, Peter, you're right.
The whole what works mind frame is really problematic. Because what works for you may not work for me because our contexts are different. And you know, that thing I put up about the Howie article, he's talking about the way in which departments of education prioritize certain sorts of research, and particularly positivist research, and undermine and undervalue kind of practitioner stories, if you will, or other sorts of qualitative research. And I mean, I've written elsewhere, you know, the big problem with ICT research and education is that it tends to be much too quantitative, much too about correlations and not understanding why, and not really looking at what is happening in practice. And we need that detailed understanding of what happens in particular contexts and particular reasons. But I know absolutely nothing about the National Research Evidence thingy, but I suspect it's a terribly neoliberal, horrible thing.
I suspect that too.
I've got two quick thoughts, Virginia, in response to your question. I think if you look at what work centres, you know, around the world, one kind of shortcoming is that they've usually had a remit of three things: to kind of build evidence, to share evidence, and to support its use. And they've tended to get stuck on the first two, of building the evidence base, you know, and then kind of synthesizing and sharing it, but not put enough investment and emotion and energy into supporting it. So I think, but if we do have a national evidence institute that looks to take that seriously, then, you know, your point about the connection to practitioner research is critical. I think the other thing I was going to say is, yeah, if you wanted to put that question to Jenny Donovan next week, come to the Q Project webinar on the 16th, and she's one of the speakers, and you can put that question to her.
I'm tempted, I can tell you. Thanks.
All right, well, we are out of time, and I can see there are questions that we didn't get to. You're welcome to send those questions to me after the session, and I can share them with our presenters. It's been an amazing conversation this last hour, and for me, one of the real take-homes is that these three types of engagement are not mutually exclusive, that you can be simultaneously participating in research, using research, and doing research. And maybe that's what quality use of research evidence looks like when you merge those three concepts together. So I want to thank my speakers who have been very generous with their time in developing amazing PowerPoint slides and then sharing their knowledge and expertise today. Mark Ricketson, Peter Twining and Shani Prendergast. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today. It's been great to have you on board, great to engage in this sort of intellectual stimulation during a period of time that's been very challenging for us all. I hope you've enjoyed today's session, and I hope these conversations can continue afterwards. Thank you.